This is our moment to define our next century. I am 100% confident that this budget is the right budget for this country at this moment. This is not a game.
The speed, scope, and scale of change that we're witnessing in Canada and around the world is quite unprecedented. That's why we need a strong response.
In Ottawa, the House of Commons fell silent. Cameras focused on Prime Minister Mark Carney as he rose to deliver his first national budget. There was no applause, no laughter, just quiet expectation. For weeks, headlines had questioned whether he could handle the pressure, whether his economic vision was too ambitious for a country caught between inflation worries and Donald Trump's tariffs. When he spoke, his voice was steady. This wasn't just a financial plan. It was the moment Canada decided what kind of nation it wanted to be in a world ruled by trade wars and uncertainty. This budget wasn't about political survival. It was about economic transformation. Carney called it a budget for the next century, and for many Canadians, it marked the start of something much bigger, a turning point in how Canada would stand on its own even as its largest trading partner turned protectionist. Before the budget day, the skepticism was intense. An Ipsos poll for Global News showed that 70% of Canadians believed the government should maintain a balanced budget. Another 42% wanted help with everyday expenses, while 32% prioritized lower income taxes. Only 1 in 4 cared about countering U.S. tariffs. Carney's opponents painted him as out of touch, accusing him of ignoring affordability and pushing Canada toward higher deficits. Yet he refused to back down. The former central banker, who once ran the Bank of England, seemed unfazed by political noise. He was focused on what he called generational investment, an idea that the country needed to build long-term strength rather than chase short-term relief. His message was unpopular but clear. Canada couldn't keep borrowing confidence from the United States. It had to earn it from within. When the numbers were released, even critics had to take a breath. The federal deficit would rise to around 75 billion Canadian dollars for the current fiscal year, according to projections cited by Reuters and the Financial Times. But the composition of that spending was what stunned observers. The budget poured tens of billions into infrastructure, railways, ports, highways, and airports, while boosting defense funding to historic levels. It also introduced targeted tax reforms to attract global investment. Companies could now write off capital assets more quickly, a move inspired by U.S. tax policy, but tailored to Canadian industries. At the same time, Carney ordered a major spending review, cutting or phasing out programs that had ballooned over the last decade. One example was the government's 2 billion trees program, which would stop halfway through. These savings would help fund what he called a pivot economy, one focused on innovation, logistics, and energy security. It was a mix of restraint and ambition, a blueprint that aimed to rebuild Canada's economic engine while keeping its fiscal credibility intact. The deeper message of the budget was not about numbers, but about strategy. Carney understood that Canada could not fight tariffs with more tariffs. Instead, he chose to fight with competitiveness. By investing in national infrastructure, modern manufacturing, and defense, Canada positioned itself as a reliable base for global supply chains that no longer trusted the volatility south of the border. The new tax structure made it easier for foreign investors to commit capital in Canada, just as American politics grew unpredictable. This approach quietly shifted Canada's role in the global trade war. Instead of reacting to Trump's pressure, Carney created the conditions to make Canada stronger without confrontation. The Financial Times called it a generational bet on national resilience. It was a different kind of power, not loud, not theatrical, but strategic. Carney also had to navigate politics. His government held a minority in Parliament, meaning one failed vote could trigger an election. Yet, through discipline and careful timing, he built a temporary bridge across party lines. NDP members, initially skeptical, found enough in the budget to avoid forcing a vote of no confidence. A few moderate conservatives even admitted the plan was more coherent than they expected. Instead of chasing applause, Carney used quiet authority. He convinced Parliament, not through slogans, but through logic, that a strong, self-sufficient Canada was in everyone's interest. Within days, media outlets described it as his first commanding political victory. For a leader only months into his tenure, it was a remarkable shift from defending his credibility to defining the national agenda. Beneath the politics lay a clear economic vision. The budget's theme, from reliance to resilience, was not just a slogan. It marked a structural pivot away from overdependence on U.S. markets. Funding was directed to projects that connected Canada more deeply with Asia and Europe. Investments in Pacific ports, digital trade infrastructure, and energy export routes were designed to support future partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and ASEAN nations. This was the economic counterpart to Carney's foreign policy message. Canada would remain a Western ally, but would no longer rely on American demand to secure growth. Economists described the shift as pragmatic rather than ideological. It recognized the reality of a changing global order where nations had to diversify or decline. For the first time in decades, Canada was not waiting for Washington to dictate its economic direction. It was charting its own course. Of course, every transformation comes with costs. Some environmental initiatives were scaled back, the emission cap program was quietly shelved, and departments across government faced cuts of up to 15% in operational budgets over 3 years, as noted by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. But the trade-off was clear. In exchange, Canada would build new industrial capacity, strengthen national defense, and protect critical mineral supply chains, areas directly threatened by the global trade conflict. For many Canadians, this was a moment of uneasy pride. The cuts were difficult, but the purpose was unmistakable. The country was taking control of its economic destiny. The message behind the numbers was simple: real independence requires real sacrifice. When the budget speech ended, there was no dramatic flourish. Carney simply closed his folder and sat down, as the chamber filled with murmurs. The opposition looked uncertain. Even his critics seemed to recognize that something had changed. Canada, for the first time in years, was not reacting to the world, it was leading with purpose. The budget silenced doubts not because it pleased everyone, but because it proved that leadership still matters. Carney had taken a divided, uncertain country and given it a clear direction: invest, adapt, and believe in itself. In an age when trade wars dominate headlines and leaders shout across borders, Canada's Prime Minister had chosen a different weapon: competence. As one analyst put it after the budget release, Trump rewrote the rules of global trade with confrontation. Carney answered with strategy. For Canada, that difference may define the next century.
If the EV tariffs are removed, then China will also remove the tariffs on the relevant products of Canada.
The premiers of Manitoba and Saskatchewan want Ottawa to scrap its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, now that China is pledging to lift its punishing tariffs on Canadian pork and canola in exchange.
While President Trump tightens every screw of his global tariff machine, another sound is rising from the north: the quiet stir of a shift Canada did not plan for but may now have to embrace. In Beijing, officials have made an unexpected offer. If Canada lifts its 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles, China will remove its punishing duties on Canadian pork and canola. The proposal sounds technical, almost bureaucratic, yet beneath it lies a potential realignment of power in North America. For years, Canada's trade path ran in one direction, south toward Washington. But with Trump's second-term tariffs squeezing every major sector, from autos to aluminum, Canada's room to maneuver has narrowed. The Chinese offer arrives like a test. Will Ottawa continue to align with Trump's protectionist wall or begin to carve a new route through it? This is not a story of friendship or betrayal. It is about survival in a moment when trade has become a weapon and allies are forced to find air wherever they can breathe. China's proposal was simple on paper but strategic in timing. Over the past year, as the United States imposed sweeping tariffs of up to 100% on Chinese imports under Section 232 and IEEPA powers, global supply chains were forced to adjust. Chinese automakers like BYD, SAIC, and NIO have been locked out of North America even as they expanded aggressively across Europe and Southeast Asia. Canada followed Washington's lead last year, matching the United States with its own 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. At the time, it was framed as solidarity with the American position, a move to protect domestic manufacturing and aligned with U.S. industrial policy. But the decision came with consequences. Within months, Beijing retaliated with tariffs on key Canadian exports, hitting pork, seafood, and canola. The duties, some as high as 75%, according to Reuters reports in August 2025, created a financial shock across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Farmers faced collapsing prices and uncertain planting seasons. That is why Beijing's latest proposal to lift those tariffs in exchange for the EV tariff being removed struck a nerve in Ottawa. It was more than a trade offer, it was a pressure valve. For China, the move signaled a tactical pivot, using market access rather than retaliation to win influence. For Canada, it forced a choice between protecting its auto industry or saving thousands of agricultural jobs. And that choice may ultimately reveal how far Trump's tariff policy has cornered his closest ally. Trump's second-term economic agenda was designed around one idea: use tariffs not only to protect American factories, but to enforce political loyalty. By applying broad, unpredictable duties, 25% on Canadian steel, 10% on aluminum, 25% on trucks and furniture, Washington turned tariffs into tools of leverage. At first, Canada complied. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government held the line, matching some tariffs and negotiating exemptions where possible. But as the trade burden deepened, provinces began to fracture. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, dependent on agricultural exports, pushed for relief. Ontario and Quebec, home to automakers and suppliers, warned against letting cheap EVs flood the market. The real turning point was not emotional, but structural. Ottawa began to realize that the United States had built a system where every Canadian industry was one policy shift away from crisis. Trump's tariffs were no longer just about China. They had created a dependency loop where U.S. domestic politics dictated Canada's economic breathing space. So when Beijing extended its hand, Canada did not see friendship, it saw an exit route. By negotiating directly with China, Ottawa could test whether its economy could survive beyond Washington's shadow. This is the deeper meaning of the backfire. Tariffs that were meant to keep supply chains loyal to the U.S. are now driving allies to experiment with new partnerships. Canada's exploration of a limited EV tariff rollback is less about siding with China and more about regaining control over its own trade agenda. Trump's policies did not just isolate China, they began to isolate the United States itself. The idea of Canada considering any economic alignment with Beijing was once unthinkable in Washington. Yet by October 2025, it is a legitimate policy debate. Ottawa's review of the EV tariff, confirmed by federal officials last week, marks the first time since the 2018 steel dispute that Canada has publicly diverged from U.S. trade direction. Economists at the University of British Columbia describe this moment as a soft decoupling. Canada is not leaving the American orbit, but it is gradually building a multi-vector trade model, one that includes the European Union, Japan, ASEAN, and increasingly China. The implications stretch far beyond tariffs. If China succeeds in reopening agricultural trade while gaining partial EV access to Canada, it could establish the first North American foothold for Chinese electric cars. That would reshape supply chains, investment flows, and potentially employment patterns within the continent. For Washington, this would be an unwelcome development. Trump's team has framed tariffs as a shield for national security. But Canada's recalibration shows that the shield can also act as a barrier between allies. The new reality is that North America no longer operates under a single economic rhythm. The United States is tightening, Canada is adapting. As China exploits the gap, the region risks drifting into two parallel systems, one protectionist and one adaptive, both competing for stability. The consequences could be long-lasting. Canada's farmers may recover, but the continent's political cohesion may not. Every tariff war eventually redraws the map. This one is no different. What began as Trump's attempt to dominate global trade has produced a more complex world, one where even America's closest neighbor is testing the edges of independence. In the short term, China's offer may give Canadian farmers the breathing room they desperately need. In the long term, it may push North America toward an economic realignment that no one fully controls. The story unfolding is not about who wins the tariff game. It is about who learns to live outside of it. Canada's choice in the coming weeks will speak louder than any statement from Washington or Beijing. Whether Ottawa decides to lift its EV tariff or hold the line, one fact is clear. Trump's trade walls are no longer